for those of you who don't know, my name is Michael Berkowitz. I'm the executive director of the Climate Resilience Institute. To my right is Jainey Bavishi. She was most recently Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and also the Deputy Administrator at NOAA. And before that, she had, I guess, one main job in New York City government. It was, let's see, she was the director of the Office of Climate Resiliency. So New York City at that time kind of bifurcated the CRO role a little bit, and you've had a big part of that. And before that, she was at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. So back and forth between national level policy and local. So we're really excited to have her. And then to the far right is Victoria Salinas, who was most recently the Deputy Administrator for Resilience at FEMA, and before that, the Oakland CRO, and has had other jobs in sort of international development that kind of touched this space, and is just embarking on a fellowship at Duke. So, and we're talking about ways that we can connect the work that's going on here with the new world that Victoria is opening up at Duke. So very excited to have these two here. And we're going to talk about a bunch of different things, hopefully, and as I said, like multi-directional. And if you guys have questions or, want to insert something, like raise your hand and let's get it going sooner rather than later. So maybe, Victoria, we'll start with you. Just talk about, I gave the very highest sketch, but talk a little bit about the personal journey, how you got here, what really drives you, in 2 minutes.
Sure. Well, great to be with you all tonight. And I'll just start by saying Miami is a place that's near and dear to my heart. I spent many of my childhood summers coming here, and my dad lived here. So it's definitely was part of my childhood, and my uncle lived here forever. My journey towards working, both I think Jainey and I, and even Michael, like we didn't go to school to study working in the area of like climate resilience. It just wasn't a thing. But for me, my journey started with really wanting to help communities have a better future. It started with an interest in international relations and conflict resolution. And a summer I spent in Cali, Colombia when I was in high school. And so undergrad, I did international politics, peace and justice was my undergrad with that international security mix. And I started looking, and I worked internationally in West Africa, in Sierra Leone after their civil war. So like post-conflict rebuilding was what I thought I was going to do. Fast forward, I did my master's in public policy and graduated in 2005, 20 years ago. That summer, what happened? Hurricane Katrina, right? And so those images of the destruction and devastation in my own country that was so reminiscent of the destruction and suffering that I'd seen in other countries made me really interested to get into disaster recovery. And at the time, at the time there was a program that existed called the Presidential Management Fellows Program. Hopefully it'll come back online in some new administration. But it was the way that I got into public service. I had been selected as a PMF. I approached FEMA, who was, of course, dealing with so many different things, and said, hey, I've been working on post-conflict reconstruction in Sierra Leone. I love problem solving. You guys have lots of problems. You should hire me for this new community recovery program. And that's what really got me into the disaster world, where I spent like the next 6 years working on community recovery in many different disasters, and then on kind of federal frameworks. Ultimately went back to the World Bank and did kind of disaster risk management globally. We met in the resilience space when 100 Resilient Cities started. But for me, that true north has always been how to like put it super simply. It's like reducing needless human suffering. Like suffering exists. Like there's many spiritual paths to talk about the value of suffering, but there is a lot of needless human suffering that we can do something about. And that's really what brought me and continues to inspire me as we work on risk reduction and community resilience.
Great. And you talk about how you got here.
Yeah. It's Also great to be here. I've just been jazzed by all the conversations I've had today. So in a moment where I think I needed a little bit of inspiration, it's been a really inspiring day. So thank you all who I've had a chance to interact with throughout the day for that. It's great to hear your origin story. I don't think I've heard it quite like that. Victoria and I have known each other for many years. So maybe a bit of a similar story with similar inflection points. I went to, I didn't enter this work from a climate standpoint at all. I entered it through justice. I was really interested in building a more just world, especially for younger generations, and ended up after college on a fellowship that took me to Orissa, India, one of the poorest states in India on the Bay of Bengal. I was working in communities below the poverty line on an advocacy campaign to start daycare centers in those communities. And when I interviewed working mothers or put cameras in the hands of what we called sibling caretakers, usually girls the ages of 5 to 7 years old, who were essentially sacrificing any chance of an education in order to be able to take care of her younger brothers and sisters, I like no interview would happen without mention of this disaster that happened 5 years before I got there, that I wasn't even aware of when I arrived there. So it was a super cyclone of 1999. It killed 10,000 people. And that's where I developed an awareness that the communities that are most economically and socially vulnerable are also the most environmentally vulnerable, something that's really well researched and documented now, but it was the first time it sort of came into focus for me. And that experience changed my entire trajectory. I decided to go to school to study urban planning. I was really interested in community development. I wanted kind of a holistic set of tools to be able to work with communities to create the conditions where they could thrive. And then on the first day of grad school, Katrina made landfall in Louisiana. It also happened to be my birthday. And it was just like, I felt called to serve as this disaster was unfolding in my own country. And so I convinced my dean to let me enroll remotely and found a professor who had just created a partnership with a foundation that was trying to support organizing and advocacy in New Orleans. And I moved to New Orleans, 4 months after the storm, and relocated there and finished my degree remotely, as I was sort of, for better or for worse, in this, living laboratory for this work. I don't think I called it climate resilience for a very long time. I think it was a while before we started using that terminology, but I think sort of a couple of things that struck me. One is that I think I learned very early on in my days in New Orleans that resilience building, even if we weren't using those terms, moves at the speed of trust. It's not always about technical solutions. It's most often about people. And I think that's been really a North Star for me as I've sort of found other roles and perches to continue advancing this work.
Yeah. And the New Orleans example to me is always like a really powerful example of this intersection between social and physical vulnerability, because in many ways we tended to think about New Orleans as a story about how big Katrina was, how the levees failed, how exposed the city was. But it's also about, the life chances in the lower ninth ward. It's about the trust in government and the endemic racism and corruption that plague both Louisiana and New Orleans, and that all in a very meaningful way sort of contributed to the outcomes. And that is really what resilience is about. Maybe Jainey, just back to you a little bit, coming from NOAA, which is a kind of it is a technical organization filled with top brilliant scientists. How did you use that orientation of the social and physical vulnerability? What did that look like in your work, and what were the barriers? Talk a little bit about carrying that through the last few years at NOAA.
Yeah, I don't think they expected someone like me to land there, right? So it was like a big surprise for them. I'm trained as an urban planner, so you got an urban planner in the number 2 seat at NOAA.
surrounded by these like esteemed physical scientists, wanting to push the agency to work in partnership with communities. And that was incredibly hard. It was incredibly hard at the leadership level. I think that, it's a place that is like evidence-based and that's like, I just want to be very clear. I like science. I really believe in science. I think scientific innovation is really important. And I think it's a really important guide in this work for sure. But I think there's more to it than just the science, right? And that's what I was pushing at NOAA. But I think it was really getting the sort of top leaders at NOAA out of their comfort zone. And that was really challenging for a whole lot of reasons. But there was also a groundswell of support from the workforce at NOAA, people scattered across programs, all across a very diverse agency, some trained in physical sciences, some not, that had been trying to bring a more equity and justice focus to NOAA's work, community orientation, an elevation of the importance of social science to the work for years, for decades sometimes, and never had that top cover, right? So I think it was really an exercise in imagining, it was not, we weren't just advancing what NOAA is, and maybe a little like sadly was, but at this point, but it was also an exercise in imagining what NOAA could be. And it was, I think it was incredibly impactful work. Sometimes I felt like I was working against a system that was never going to bend, but I was also not willing to bend. So, you could imagine the fireworks that like ensued, but I think we did bring a lot of people along, and we made some, real headway, some, I think, lasting community partnerships, and some real cultural change. And I know you can't see it anymore in this current moment we're in, but I don't think that kind of change disappears that quickly either.
Yeah. And listening to Jainey, Victoria, I'm also reminded of your effort to infuse social vulnerability more centrally in FEMA's work with community disaster resilience zones and other programs. And you also experience some of the institutional headwinds that are in an agency that size with that, history. Talk about how, why that change was important and how you went about doing it.
Yeah. So one of the things that it's been about, but before going to FEMA, I was at a nonprofit called Fuse Corps that embeds private sector executives in local government. And I'd helped develop our curriculum around racial equity. And so I had very well instilled in me this kind of difference between equality and equity. And when I arrived, and I think in emergency management and oftentimes in government, we just want everyone to have the same thing. And they were like, that's great, everyone has access. But that's not the same thing as everyone having exactly what they need to survive and thrive. And so that was kind of the perspective and why I was excited to work in the last administration, because of that kind of focus on the intersection of climate inequity and resilience. And so it was interesting I never thought I was going to go back to FEMA. I was there for 6 years. I was excited to look for an opportunity in the Biden administration, did not think FEMA. And so when I was approached to interview for my role there, I did my homework and I was like, well, this agency 10 years ago, I was constantly hitting my head against the wall, trying to get us to think about communities, to do things differently. And there had been thinking and work around this issue of helping underserved communities. So that was positive in terms of headwinds. But when I got in there, I saw that we were still very much in an early stage where it was still kind of like a focus on trying to help everybody equally, not really yet. It was still early days and understanding how to support underserved communities. And having been a chief resilience officer in Oakland, California, one of the things that always really stuck with me in terms of the difference between equal and equity was how we prepare communities for the big earthquake, right? In California, it's 72 hours, you need to be on your own. And in East Oakland, and in the Berkeley Hills, that looks radically different, right? So
East Oakland poor, Berkeley
poor,
Hills,
lots of affluent. Exactly. And so the community organizations that the people need in East Oakland versus the independence that you can do when you've got resources, like vastly different. So that was kind of the perspective that I came to the work at FEMA with, and found similarly so many people that were just thrilled to have that top cover to like look at these issues differently and really try and push the system to go as far as it possibly could go. But again, to Jainey's point, our federal government and so many government systems were not designed to help everybody like they need to be met. They were designed to just kind of like provide services oftentimes. And so the last several years, I do think there was a great deepening of how we provide technical assistance to communities, how we focus in on who needs the most help, how you get that last mile assistance in. Like, so even with the changes going on, there is a level of awareness of how you can make the system bend towards a better future, even if in reality we need to do some real rewiring of our systems.
Yeah. And so now you guys are both talking about 2024 and before. Give us a little sense of what, I know this is a little bit depressing because you've spent, some of your life's work is getting unwound a little bit, but give us a sense of, where you think we are now and like how we should think about operating within the constructs of the reality of today.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're experiencing policy whiplash. I think that's like the given, the obvious. And it's really unfortunate. I think it sends communities in different directions. They're trying to figure out how to sort of stay viable or keep their projects viable. Funding windows are like closing as quickly as they're opening, right? Funding's being revoked. I think equity, I'm like starting with the bad news. Equity, I think, is like the first thing to be taken off the table. Like, I mean, it's clearly a bad word right now. And it's when budgets shrink, it's like the thing that often is expendable, unfortunately. I think we've sort of arrived at this moment where I think we could be scaling. Like there's fatigue around pilot projects, right? And I feel like we're a little bit like stuck in sort of that place where like the pendulum swings every time, we're sort of at this moment to take things to the next phase. So all of that's incredibly unfortunate. But I think there are opportunities in this moment too. I think, we're actually sort of being forced to think about how to make this work more durable. I think, there's an opportunity to think about institutional resilience, for example. Like, how do we actually protect this work from these pendulum swings? I'm, for example, working on a project to think about the national climate assessment. Like that's something that we've traditionally thought of as a product from the federal government. Does it need to be a product from the federal government? Should it exist outside of government so that it's shielded from these kind of policy swings that we're experiencing? I think there's an opportunity to think about the roles of other sectors, right? Like, how do we get philanthropy in the mix, private sector in the mix? How do we start thinking about capitalizing this work differently so that we're not solely dependent on federal money? Because like, we have to be clear that the notion that the federal government was going to fund all of the resilience and adaptation work that's needed across the country was never realistic to begin with. So while the revocation of funding is incredibly tragic and irresponsible, I think it's also sort of the push that we needed to think more creatively. So I'm really heartened by that. I think there are all kinds of interesting coalitions forming, right? Whether they're like regional coalitions or partnerships between the private sector and local or state governments. I think, states are thinking about their role differently right now. So there's like all kinds of innovation that's happening that I actually think is going to serve the field really well. It's all about sort of like going head in on that and just figuring out how do we make the work continue even with everything that's going on at the federal level.
Yeah, and I was just reminded of this effort to do data rescue that the New York Climate Exchange was and is leading, and raised a non-trivial amount of money, something like $25 to $30 million, to help rescue climate data climate and vulnerability data, actually, that was sitting on federal servers that we were nervous that was going to go away. And the silver lining there, to kind of to your point, is that it used to sit in a bunch of different places in the federal government and was kind of hard to get your hands on, although there were efforts to sort of fix that in your time. But if we're going to move it all to a server in New Jersey, like, wow, that's a real opportunity to fundamentally reshape the user interface and how we actually get access to that. And that could be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Victoria, how are you thinking about these times and what our opportunities are?
So I've always been like an unflappable optimist. So I always look for like, where is there opportunity to continue making progress? And some of my takeaways from the last several years was that there's things that the federal government and government in general can't do. And we had, and there's things that, even having worked in local government, worked in nonprofits, there's excuses we always use for why progress is slow. Oh, there's not enough money. Oh, there's not enough technical assistance. Like, we can always find an excuse for why things aren't going as fast as we want them to. And so we lived through a moment where there was historic federal funding, where we, at FEMA, we had a direct technical assistance program as part of the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. When I started, we were helping 12 communities, and I said, let's double this every year until we're like helping 100 new communities each year, and we did it, right? Like, so we were pouring resources in, but it still didn't solve the problems. Like, I was still showing up in Puerto Rico, in the San Juan Bay, and seeing like, great, we're funding $40 million of coral reef between FEMA and HUD, but like the private sector that's going to benefit from less wave attenuation and like better beachfront dining and tourism and fewer deaths due to drowning, like no clue this is happening, right? So there was still this, in some ways, some displacement of potential private sector partnership, entities benefiting from these things, but who weren't part of the solutions. And so I think for me, that's one of the big takeaways, is that there's so much shared interest in a better future, that this is an opportunity to really peel that back and figure out more concretely, how do we actually activate the private sector differently? And I have worked with the private sector many times, and I'm not I wasn't born and bred in the private sector. And so for me, I'm really seeing, we're seeing a trend, and it's a trend that's kind of been coming these last couple of years, of companies and corporations recognizing they have physical risk, recognizing that there's an economic impact, productivity loss, et cetera. So that trend, coupled with the fact there's less federal dollars coming in, is this real opportunity for people to reinvest in risk reduction, resilience, adaptation. And then even more, like California has like these new climate-related financial risk disclosures. So the more we like look at that, the more to do something about that climate-related financial risk, it's like, oh, our assets are in the Bay Area, where this local government would like to fix their stormwater problem, and we're also affected by the stormwater problem. Can we co-invest?
Yeah.
And so I do think that's where we're going to see progress that we would not have seen if there was a lot of federal subsidy going into these things. My hope is that one day, like, given the deficit we have in investment in infrastructure in this country and in communities, we see the use of taxpayer dollars to bolster this go up again. But in the meantime, there's so much progress to be made. And I do think that the building blocks are there for us to take kind of a giant leap forward, and how the private sector, both on the investment side, but also solutions in the marketplace side, are more robustly contributing.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that, where we, the three of us, have been involved in conversations around something, that we're calling a resilience finance lab. But its purpose is to think about how we better monetize risk reduction and resilience. And this is different than climate finance broadly, because climate finance usually is about energy transition, and energy transition comes with a revenue source. You build a wind farm or a solar farm, and you have a revenue source that you can finance on the back of. Borrow money and you pay back based on the profits that you make from the energy generation. But when you build a better seawall or breakwater using sea hive and heat tolerant corals, or you plant trees and communities and reduce heat and flooding that way. How do you actually monetize that benefit? We know there are huge benefits. There are benefits to health, there are benefits to loss and damage, all these different things, but trying to figure out a way to actually, get that to pay back as an investment would is difficult. So maybe I'll start with you, Jainey, and then Victoria, if you have additional thoughts. Like, why are you interested in this, and like, what particular elements are you most excited about the resilience finance? Because it's a lot of different things. It's insurance and rating agencies and better public financing and creative equity investments. Like, it's a whole bunch of things. Yeah. Why are you interested, and what are you particularly interested in?
So I think at the core of this work, it's really about figuring out how to make resilience investable, right? And it's a question of what we value, and actually getting put people to put money towards those things that we value, right? And I think that, and there's a lot of excitement around resilience finance right now, actually. Like, I think a lot of people are having conversations about it, but I don't think like anyone's really quite like cracked the nut of we haven't like found the grand solution yet, right? But I think the reason I'm interested in it is two things. One, I already mentioned, I think this is not just about like technical finance solutions. I'm not a technical finance person, but I think it is really about figuring out what we value, right? Like there's some like cultural shifting, systemic shifting that needs to happen to actually like direct resources to those things we value. Like, I value having a habitable planet and like making sure that the next generation has like a place that, they can thrive. So like let's put money towards that, right? Let's put money towards a future that we can imagine. And I also think that it is ultimately about connecting a ton of dots. And like, I think I didn't sort of mention that as part of my origin story, but ultimately, like, that is what I love about this work, is connecting the dots between different disciplines, between people who don't usually work together, about like sort of being a translator and a broker. And I'm excited about that. I'm excited about bringing my experience to help sort of brokering those partnerships and like thinking about big problems a bit differently.
What's an example of those dots connected in this context? So to give us
and go to Victoria for some point.
Okay. What are you most excited about?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is having worked in local government for a while, one of the things I found was that we're always trying to kind of solve the problem with whatever resources we had in our budget. It was always very resource constrained, always kind of like reprioritizing based on what we thought we could do. And in some ways, looking at how we finance investments in resilience differently is an opportunity to solve problems at the right scale rather than the Band-Aid solutions. And this year, as I started talking with folks who invest in kind of infrastructure, one of the things that just really kind of surprised me was talking to these big investors with billions of dollars that are somewhat agnostic about where they put their money so long as there's a return. And they're like, oh, we don't really invest in things that are less than $100 million. And for local governments, this idea of like, what's your big solution? What does it actually truly cost to deal with stormwater, sea level, retrofit all those earthquake-prone homes in the Bay Area? Like, we never actually, or rarely have that opportunity to like look at the big solution that would create real outcome level change and then figure out who benefits and how do we turn that benefit into a co-investment? Like, that's just not the conversation that most jurisdictions are having. But to unlock the private capital, that's the conversation we have to have. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about, is like bringing together the expertise to really understand at scale what those solution sets are, who benefits, how we co-invest, and really kind of bring capital together in a different way. But I think the other piece that, again, my background is in municipal finance, there are a lot of existing tools that we haven't yet leveraged for building resilience, whether it's green banks that focused on water and energy, but not necessarily drought resilience in the same right way, or revolving loans that have cheap capital debt that like local governments can access that we haven't yet fully capitalized on. So I feel like there's the new things that we can do, and there's really using existing tools for the problems of today and tomorrow. And that feels doable to me. So in terms of what I'm excited about, these things feel like they're achievable.
In that first bucket of new things and the conversations around the big solutions that we collectively had a little bit in New York, we in September we were in New York and we had this conversation about the New York City Cloudburst Initiative, which is a set of community scale green infrastructure across the city that is meant to reduce flash flooding, like you've seen, with the water going into the trains and people getting flooded out of their basements and all the things, headlines that you've seen. And, that entire solution is a big number. It's like $30 billion across the city. Some of that would be gray infrastructure, some of that would be green infrastructure, but that's a huge, interesting project that would excite any banker. But a question for you though is like, why do you think we're not having those conversations? Like what's preventing us?
I think there's a couple things. When I think it's the kind of scale that we're solving problems at, particularly on the local government side sometimes, and even the expertise, like and so for instance, during Climate Week in New York, I was able to chat with some of the folks in Philadelphia, and like their resilience person was like, I walked by the finance office and like they kind of like skirt away from me because they see everything I want to do as just like a cost. Or we have stormwater issues and like the water department, like again, like they see me as resilience and they think cost. Whereas in other places, we're starting to see like Harris County, the city of Jersey Village in Harris County, like they realize that turning their municipal golf course into a water detention or detention space was going to keep all of these homes dry. And then like after Burl came through, it did just what it was supposed to do. And like 2 days later, people were golfing and going to like the municipal like bar at the golf course. Meanwhile, the private sector golf courses were jealous, right? So like they realized, and it was a cost center. Like suddenly this like municipal golf course that was always a sink of money was a cost, like was creating revenue for the city. So I think that's part of this shift is like, how do we actually not consider, how do we make that pivot to understanding the value, capturing the value, articulating it so that resilience officers around the world and those trying to do this work, people aren't like, there comes the person who just wants to spend more.
Yeah.
I actually, if we're talking about thinking about the same golf course, there's this great quote from a resident who lives by the golf course. It might be this one or a different one here in the same area, that said, now, not only is my house not flooding, but my husband's exercising every day because they've like built like nature trails and community gardens and all these other great features in the golf course. So I think like that's the holy grail, right? Like these resilience projects that are reducing damage, right, and improving safety, but also just improving quality of life, right? And so I love that quote. But I actually think that part of the reason we haven't been able to talk about the big solutions is because of federal funding. Like I think our imagination has actually been limited by federal grants, right? What BRIC offers $50 million?
That's like tiny compared to the solutions.
Yeah. So like, how is New York City ever going to imagine a $30 billion proposal if it can only get $50 million for any given project from federal government, right? And like, right. And having worked in New York City, right? I mean, on the coastal resilience side of things, I'm like loving seeing the headlines on the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, a $1.4 billion coastal resilience project that got started after Sandy with a $335 million grant from HUD. I can promise you, like the delta between $335 million from HUD and $1.4 billion is all city funded. So the city has skin in the game. But we would have never gotten that project off the ground without a federal grant. It was an incredibly important catalyst to build political will and to get people at the table. So I think with that being the primary source of funding to get these projects going, it's actually limited what we can imagine.
Yeah, that's a great segue into something I wanted to talk about because I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like the post-disaster opportunity. And I've been thinking about it a little bit from like, what could this institution do after the next Hurricane Andrew, but also thinking about it broadly, like what could communities do? But the, East Side Coastal Resiliency Project that Jainey mentioned was a Rockefeller grant to NYU, who then ran a design competition that led to an idea that then the city really built out and continued to like fund, and that leveraged HUD funding, but also other streams of funding. And so that's like and changed the conversation of the resilience profession a little bit through something, what I'm referring to here is what was called rebuild by design. So that's like a best case post-disaster.
Yeah, best case, but it was like it's an incredibly painful story.
Yeah.
I just want to like
Yeah.
So that was like all more than a decade ago, and now we're seeing the project come to fruition.
We just cut the ribbon like 2 months ago.
For section like phase 1 of the project.
For phase 1, with the highest capacity city in the country, with the biggest budget, like all these things lined up, and still painful, decadal, like action. So I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts about like what the opportunity? Let's say Hurricane Andrew 2.0 hits Miami tomorrow, next month, next season probably. What's our opportunity? How should we be thinking about that as an institution?
Yeah, so I can tell you a different New York City story related to this too, and I actually shared it at our student coffee earlier today, and it's related to stormwater and cloud. So in May of 2021, my office, Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, in compliance with local law, developed a stormwater resiliency plan. There was not a single dollar behind the stormwater resiliency plan. We briefed it all the way up City Hall. We said, we need to be paying attention to the risk of precipitation, extreme precipitation. And they said, but we're building the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. And we said, yes, that's coastal flooding for storm surge and sea level rise. We have this other risk that's going to impact inland communities. We did all the education, and there was just no political will. And then 4 months later, the remnants of Ida went through New York City, and 4 people died in their basement apartments, and the subways were flooded, and roads were flooded, and I mean, New York City was literally underwater. And the next morning, the first thing I did was get up and email the first deputy mayor our stormwater resiliency plan. And I said, we have the plan. We know what to do. And by the end of the month, we had $2 billion behind the stormwater resiliency plan. And so I think this disasters open up political windows. It's just it's always going to be true. And so I really hope that our cultural paradigm changes, and that we're not just waiting for the next disaster to take action. I think that it is changing, right? It is really heartening to see more funding opportunities. And I do think there are more sort of diverse funding opportunities for proactive resilience now than there was 10 years ago or during Sandy times. But whether it's, Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law funding, that, by the way, there's still many dollars out there, right, that are being implemented, including here, or state resilience bonds or other things. But I think it will always be true that funding will flow after a disaster, or political windows will open after disasters. And I think that example is just a great case study in how you have to be ready for those moments, whatever the big ideas are.
Yeah, I think on the disaster recovery front, particularly, I think part of your question was how can the university play a role there too? I think there's a couple of things. One is that with the recovery, for it to be resilient and not just be the rinse and repeat. And I do think that we're at risk of entering a world where recovery becomes very much a business model, right? We've seen a year where the federal government has not authorized the hazard mitigation grant program. We've entered a time where there's just fewer disaster declarations. And so if we're not also doing the risk reduction part of recovery, then you're just rebuilding the vulnerability. And then the people and states don't have the capacity to build strong emergency management agencies. And so the private sector that helps with the recovery, worst case scenario, its incentives would be, from a profit perspective, to continue to help with the recovery, right? So that is like the worst case scenario, where it becomes a profit motive to just do subpar recovery. So enter universities, enter community partnerships. I think there's a really important, enter local government. Like your example, Jainey, there was a local law that asked for this thing that was done. It was preparation, right? Like the university partnerships that help on the data, the analytics, the community engagement, all of that preparation truly matters for having the vision, knowing what needs to be done, understanding where there's vulnerability, having a game plan. Even the partnerships that like this university has with foundations, with the private sector, like those community conversations happening year round, being evergreen, are also key to make recovery go easier. And even on the side, we have a lot of folks from this school of civil engineering here, right? Like one of the things that I find so painful about the cloudburst example that Jainey shared is how and even your like the resilience park examples is a decade of getting through the community and the permitting and the this and the that, and then another decade of building it all out, right? So like our traditional approaches to infrastructure development aren't keeping pace with the speed in which we're suffering disaster impacts. And so I do think there's so much opportunity to figure out how we, particularly in this age where we've got like technology as a new kind of enabler at a different level, like how do we find those new technologies faster? How do we shorten the time from disaster impact to recovery complete? Like those are all things that I think universities and institutions like this one are very well positioned to help communities figure out, because it's not after the event that those things start.
Great. Are there questions or comments?
Where you left off, Victoria, I want to go back to you said, Michael, about resilience financing. But when you're thinking about resilience financing, what are the components of the financing? What is it? Technology? So what are the ingredients that needs to be financed, and can those be perhaps looked at from what you just said about how can we leap forward faster? Is there a component or an ingredient that we're missing in the financing that whether it's is, or it's the workforce, or education, or partnerships, or preparedness that can help shrink that gap?
Yeah. I would break it into two different buckets in terms of kind of like technological investment and like an investment in new technologies approaches, and then like project finance, like kind of put those two things in very different buckets. I think what I'm observing, at least in like the adaptation and resilience climate tech space, is that you have more funds starting or existing funds that want to invest in companies. And a group that I recommend you guys look at their materials, Tailwind Futures, has done a really nice analysis of like the range of adaptation and resilience solutions, where there's companies right now, where there's not enough companies, like heat and so is one of those areas where their analysis shows there's not enough startup ideas yet. And so you see kind of like solutions starting, funds who want to invest, but then you also have so much great research happening in places like universities. But and we were having this conversation earlier today, like an engineer coming up with a new approach may not want to be an entrepreneur. Like those are very different life choices, things that energize you. And so bringing together people who are passionate about climate, but also entrepreneurship with the inventors, like that's one of those missing things, because the money is starting to be there of people and companies who want to invest, but having the thing from the lab be big enough to suddenly connect with the investment is a major gap in kind of that technological innovation space. And then on the project finance space, I think some of it is we haven't maximized cheap debt. Like local governments haven't maximized all the cheap debt that they can access, but then it leads to the community conversation issue, right? You have these tools that you can maximize, but like voters have to like be willing to sign up for investing in the next generation of infrastructure for community. And so it becomes more of a risk communication challenge than like a technical challenge in some cases.
So does everyone understand what Victoria, that last point there is? You could do a bond where you get money at, depending on the term of the bond, but let's say 2 or 3 or at the most, 3.5%. That's pretty cheap debt. And you could use it to mitigate risks, that would be a choice that governments could make. But you usually need your, voters to approve that bond issuance. And, which has been, as Jim can attest to here, tricky. We've seen the rating agencies favor better balance sheets over climate risk reduction. So if you take a lot of debt obligation, that might hurt you more with the rating agencies than the climate risk that you're actually mitigating through that. So that's a little bit of what's going on. But those tools are out there, and that's part of what we're hoping that we'll explore with the lab.
And can I just add one thing? I think we also need philanthropy then to invest in community capacity, right? Because if we don't have the person who works on resilience in many municipalities wears 10 other hats, right? Like these are not. This is not a mainstream profession yet. We're seeing it grow, but there's still more investment just needed in the capacity. And so to get a project to the place where you could get a bond, right? I mean, like where you're convincing your OMB, your Office of Management and Budget, your whatever the budget office is, to access the cheap debt to finance the project, you need the capacity to get it there, and that is a lot of work. So we need that to happen. Both because otherwise the projects won't happen, but also I think to make sure that we're still keeping equity and justice at the center of this work.
Yeah. Pranay.
In the last several years, it feels a little like public perception of science is going down. Public trust of universities is kind of going down. And it's very easy to say, it's not us, it's them. But I'm not sure that's a positive mindset. And two, also, I think we have to acknowledge that when we're getting federal funding, it is taxpayer money, and we have a responsibility to the public, right? So there's this gap, and I always, when people say academics, oh God, elitist people in ivory towers, right? I always feel that's not the case. But when I have conversations with some people, I go back and I'm like, good Lord, we are very elitist, right? So, and then, some it's hard because when you specialize, when you really specialize, you get into these crazy niches, and then it's very hard to get out of. So the reason I want to ask you this question, and the question is basically, what would you do differently in a university or as academics, is because you have this very unique opportunity where you've been on the inside, but you've also been on the outside, and you've been adjacent as well. So for both of you, what would you do differently as a university or as academics, broadly speaking?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think has promise for really grounding the work of universities and what communities and our society needs is more interdisciplinary conversations about the types of solutions that we need. So like if for instance, across the university, there was a conversation on the different types of extreme heat solutions that we need in South Florida, out of the woodwork probably would be a lot of different things that relate to addressing extreme heat. But oftentimes it's the dual use. It's like I was talking to some students just earlier this week that invented some platform that collects data when you go into the ER and it does early warning that the patient might be at risk of sepsis. And I was like, oh, if you could do early warning for that, and it's AI generated, right? It's like you can probably do early warning for this. It's we're going through a heat dome. Here's all the characteristics of the person. They're probably suffering from like all of these different things, but the team wasn't thinking about the application of their research for extreme heat because it just wasn't part of their focus, right? And so my point is simply that those interdisciplinary conversations about, is there something you're doing that has this other beneficial use for one of these climate challenges, disaster risk challenges we're facing? And so I do think that that can help kind of like bring together various threads of research and ground it in like what's going to help communities today.
I agree with Victoria. I think resilience is embedded in everything. And so, bridging across disciplines, bridging across theory and practice, really preparing students to work in cities and institutions outside of academia, and I think University of Miami is already doing a really good job of this, by the way, and bridging across sort of different, what do I want to call it? Like different approaches to knowledge, right? Like it's not just like technical knowledge, but also indigenous knowledge. It's thinking about community wisdom as well as data and science sort of at the same time. How do you sort of think about all those sort of sources of knowledge, different ways of knowing, that's what I was looking for. But also, I think there's another, like when you started, Prannoy, with talking about science, I think one thing that we haven't focused enough on in the resilience field is implementation science. I think there are actually a lot of solutions out there. We know what the solutions are, but how do we actually make those solutions happen? How do we get it done? And I don't think we have enough. There is like, we need to study that, right? Like, how do you get it from concept to reality? How do we start making that more systemic so that to get to a lot of the themes we've already touched on so that we can do that more quickly? So I think there's an opportunity there that universities could lean into, and it would, by necessity, require us to lean into communities, understand what they're thinking, have those exchanges and interactions that then inform this sort of new field of science.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it's worth just pointing out that most of the audience here are the technical solution innovators and not the implementation. We don't have anyone from, like, let's say political science or law or, and there's some reasons for that. I mean, a bunch of our colleagues from law are at COP and BLM right now, and, but like, cool, maybe that's, I'm just being a little self-reflective. Like maybe it's a little shame on us for not pulling those folks more into this conversation. And we do talk about it. We run, for instance, a working group around regulatory challenges related to novel coastal infrastructure. But, it's like, it's a little bit of a slog, and it's not as sexy as, cool biophilic structures or low carbon cement. And so concrete. And so that's really that's a little bit of that's kind of the where we find ourselves. I think we're close to the end, but I want to see any student perspectives or thoughts.
I'm just a senior getting my undergrad here.
In what major?
Marine biology and ecology.
Okay.
And I'm starting to do some work with CRI, hopefully getting the internship next spring. But so coming from at least an introductory level sustainability background, as someone who's interested in getting involved in sustainable infrastructure, how could I, or at least members of the community, bridge the gap between this far off problem and these overarching huge research ideas and really get some change going just in my day-to-day life?
And maybe before you answer that, I'll cut to head with another question. What are your thoughts on young students, when we talk about wanting to be better prepared before disasters happen and, having the resources? What are your thoughts on actually requiring resilience education, whether it's bonds or infrastructure resilience, into
general ed requirements of early, like freshman, sophomore year, general ed requirements in academic institutions? Could that help someone like this gentleman, for example, be better prepared and ready, and making that link from the far research and to applied science to community engagement, a full spectrum?
Yeah. So part of your question is also just like your daily life as like a human being, or as like as a 21-year-old finishing their education.
As a college student who is looking to integrate more sustainable perspectives into my life, as someone, so how do I commute? What am I eating? What are some of these changes that I guess are influenced by a lot of, funded research happening like far up in science? How do I just bridge the gap between, and maybe this applies to just American populace, how do we bridge the gap between the research happening on climate resilience and what Americans know about it, and how they're able to change their perspective and their paradigms and kind of align themselves more with trying to make a change?
I think there's a lot of ways that we can actually take kind of that resilience lens to our own lives, right? Because it actually starts with us. Like community resilience starts with each of us. And so wherever you are in kind of your life cycle, that kind of understanding your risks, like that's like the basic, right? So like understanding the risk like that you face where you live, your family, etc. Like and knowing what to do about it is part of kind of that pathway. Like my mom lives in Austin, Texas. I have an alert on my phone about the weather there, so I can check in on my 70-year-old mother when the weather gets bad, and like she lives near a forested area, so I'm constantly like, what's your evacuation route when this like goes down? And like literally she was visiting me this past weekend. I'm like, well, I think all the traffic's gonna go this way, so you should try and go. So like really just like understanding, I think that's one way, because that risk awareness of like current and future risk is such a backbone of sustainability and resilience, that practicing that and having that always be part of your paradigm in your personal family, your projects, I think is just a good muscle to build. And then even like the examples you gave are wonderful from like a sustainability perspective, reducing greenhouse gases, et cetera, et cetera. And but I think that the kind of additional layer I would put on when we talk about resilience is sustainability is part of that, adaptation is part of that, but also training, and this I think gets to your question a little bit. One of the things I would distinguish with resilience is that it's really this critical thinking around co-benefits. Like when you do something, what are all the beneficial things that you could drive because you do it? Like you like to bike to campus? Great. Is there somebody else who like needs a little more exercise in your life who you want to encourage to like bike to campus with you? Like there's a co-benefit there, a buddy, and you're helping somebody else's like health outcomes. So I think that kind of co-benefits thinking is actually, whether you call it resilience or you call it critical thinking, there's this kind of systemic there's this need for all of us and like the incoming generations in particular to understand how systems are connected, how you can choose to do whatever you want to do in life. But if you do it in a slightly different way, you can create more good. You can help more people. You can add more value. And I think that's kind of the pivot. It doesn't mean everyone in the world has to be a resilience practitioner, but if everything we do can actually just create a little bit more value across different systems, we're all going to be better off. So I think those two things are what I would encourage, just to kind of like practice building those muscles that no matter what you do are going to help things be better.
I think that's a great response. And I actually want to just tell a personal anecdote. So we moved back to DC from New York about 3 years ago. And we live in the DC area. We actually live in Hyattsville, Maryland, which is actually quite a flood prone area. And we live in this new development that's on infill. So the land was elevated to map us out of the flood zone. And then there are these beautiful stormwater ponds at the foot of our neighborhood. I mean, I always knew this, right? Like I knew that was like the structure of my neighborhood. And just in the last 10 months after I left my, office job at NOAA, I have come to loving walking around these stormwater ponds and enjoying the wildlife. Like there was a wildlife photographer photographing a heron at the stormwater pond, the blue heron at the stormwater ponds the other day. And I was like, I get this in my backyard, right? So what's funny about this is that like, I just didn't appreciate those co-benefits. Like I lived there for 3 years, and for 2 of them, I was like so busy with my day-to-day life that I like just never took in the beauty and like the peace of mind. And like, I mean, I really think that these stormwater ponds have substantially increased the quality of my life over the past 10 months in a way that I just didn't even notice before, right? And so I think it is like, I talk about them with everyone because it's not just about like noticing risk, but it's also like bragging about these co-benefits, right? Like, let's start imagining a future. We can't build what we can't imagine, right? Like, and so let's start imagining it. And I think to get to your question, like to me, it's not just what is resilience education, right? I mean, I'm sure that there are many people in this room who have an answer to that, but to me, it's about practicing humility because I don't think resilience practitioners, like the best leaders that I have seen, are not the smartest people in the room. They're the people who can listen to everyone and like find a path forward, right? So it's about practicing humility and practicing range, right? Like being a connector of many different perspectives and disciplines. It's about understanding how money and power flow, because like if you don't understand that, then you cannot get project from concept to implementation. It's about staying grounded in communities, right? Data guides us, but communities ground us. And I think like go to a community meeting, like go to as many community meetings as you can, bring up, like ask, how are you taking climate into account in this project, right? Like just ask that simple question, because we often create these silos in our minds about like what is a climate project and what is a housing project, or what is a climate project and what is a workforce development project. But everything is a climate project. Everything should be a climate resilience project, because if we're not thinking about it that way, we're not thinking about the future, right? So like just let's start the conversation. And then I think the last thing, back to resilience education, is about creating that space. Like let's give ourselves space to be creative, because if we can't be creative, we can't bring to the work the joy and imagination that it requires. And like I said, we can't build what we can't imagine. So let's get together and put on our most creative hats to imagine the future we want.
I think that's pretty great. Thank you all.